The cold Alpha King ignored her letters for 5 years. He returned to find a son with his eyes. Her grandmother used to say, "A seed planted in stone does not die. It waits for the crack that lets the light through." Marin Ashvale did not understand that saying when she was a girl pressing wildflowers into the margins of her schoolbooks. She understood it even less the night Calder Voss kissed her in the dark of the Thornfield midsummer fire, with sparks rising around them like a second set of stars, and then left before the ashes were cold. She thought she understood it the morning she discovered she was carrying his child, and sat alone at her kitchen table with her hands pressed flat against the wood, steadying herself against the spin of a world that had shifted without warning. She did not truly understand it until 5 years later, when the stone cracked. She kept his first letter, the only one he ever sent her, folded inside a tin of dried rosemary on her windowsill. It was not a love letter. It was 8 words scratched in a language that tried to sound formal. "Do not contact the keep again. C. Voss." She had written to him 7 times. That was his single reply. She kept it anyway, not out of sentiment, out of evidence. Evidence that she had tried, and that the failing had not been hers. Chapter 1. What a wolfless girl is worth the village of Dunmore sat at the hem of the Ashfin Mountains, the way a threadbare skirt sits at the ankle, ragged, practical, and largely invisible to anyone on horseback. Marin had grown up here without a wolf, which in a pack world made her slightly less visible than the skirt. Wolfless shifters were not unheard of. They were simply unregarded. The wolf blood ran thin in some bloodlines, especially the old cottage families like the Ashvales, who had once been healers and herbalists rather than hunters. Marin could not shift. She could not feel the pack bond. She could, however, read a fever in a child's brow before the thermometer confirmed it, mix a poultice that closed wounds faster than the pack physician's salves, and carry a basket of provisions up an icy mountain path without complaint. The village made use of her. It did not celebrate her. She had a son, and that was enough to fill the rooms of her life so completely that sometimes she forgot there were people who thought her life was less than full. His name was Emmerich. He was 4 years old the autumn the Alpha King's envoy came to Dunmore, and he was sitting in the dirt outside Marin's cottage, trying to coax a moth onto his finger with the focused intensity of a scholar. He had silver-gray eyes so particular in their shade, not blue, not green, not the warm brown of Marin's family, that every person who met him paused. Those eyes looked like they belonged to someone who expected to be obeyed. Marin was inside, grinding dried yarrow when she heard the hooves. She looked out the window at the 2 riders in black and silver livery, and felt the yarrow dust settle on her hands like a fine gray snow. She knew those colors. She had addressed 7 envelopes to the household that flew them. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door before they could knock. Chapter 2. The King's Business in a Small Place. The envoy's name was Aldrich, and he was the kind of man who looked perpetually surprised to find himself somewhere beneath his dignity. He had papers. He had a seal. He had the slightly pained expression of someone who had ridden 4 days to deliver news he found distasteful. Marin did not invite him inside. She stood in the doorway with the autumn light on her face and waited. The Alpha King Calder Voss requests a full census of all wolfless residents in the Dunmore Valley. Aldrich's eyes skimmed her with professional blankness. There is a new pack welfare designation. Wolfless citizens are to be registered, their situations assessed, any dependents noted. My son is not a dependent to be noted in a ledger. Her voice was quiet. Quiet was not the same as soft. Aldrich blinked. The second rider, younger, looked at his hands. It is the King's directive, mistress. Ashvale. Marin Ashvale. She watched his pen hesitate over the name. You may write it down. And you may note that I have a child, 4 years of age, in good health. No current need of royal welfare provisions. We are entirely self-sufficient. Good day. She would have closed the door except that Emmerich chose that moment to appear at her hip, moth-forgotten, eyes wide with the frank curiosity of small children who have no social fear yet. Aldrich looked at the boy. His pen stopped moving. Those silver-gray eyes. That jaw, even at 4 years old, holding the same angle, stubborn, considered, already aristocratic. Aldrich had served Calder Voss for 11 years. He knew that face in its adult form. He knew it the way a person who works in a mint knows currency. The silence stretched in a direction Marin had always feared. Mistress Ashvale. Aldrich's voice had changed register entirely. I wonder, does the king know? She met his gaze without flinching. The king was informed. The king replied. Both of those things are documented. She laid her hand on Emmerich's shoulder. Whatever you wish to report to the keep, report accurately. She closed the door. Then she went to the kitchen table, pressed her hands flat against the wood, exactly as she had done 4 years ago, and breathed. Chapter 3, 7 letters and 8 words. She had written the first letter before she was certain. That one she burned because it had been written in fear and desperation, and she did not want to send fear and desperation to a man who already thought little of her. The second letter she wrote when certainty arrived. It was careful and measured, and gave him the fact. A fact, the most primary possible fact, without pleading or accusation. She stated what she needed. Acknowledgement. She stated what she did not need. His money, his intervention, his presence, if he could not give those things willingly. She had mailed it with shaking hands, and then told herself it had nothing to do with the night at the midsummer fire, or with the way he'd looked at her across the flames, not like a king surveying a lesser thing, but like a man who had stumbled upon something he hadn't expected and didn't know what to do with. That look had lasted approximately 1 night, and then disappeared entirely. His reply came 6 weeks later. 8 words and an initial. She'd read it 4 times and then folded it until it was very small and placed it in the rosemary tin, and she had kept writing. 6 more letters over 18 months, each one clear, factual, dignified. Each one returned unopened, with a stamp that said, correspondence declined in the keep's bureaucratic ink. After the 7th letter she stopped. Not because she had given up, because she understood that she had met the full extent of what he was willing to do, and that continuing to press her face against that particular locked door was a harm she was choosing to do to herself. She planted a kitchen garden instead. She planted it in the strip of rocky soil behind the cottage that everyone said would grow nothing. She grew extraordinary tomatoes. Also parsnips, which she did not particularly like but grew anyway out of principle. Chapter 4. The king comes down from the mountain. Calder Voss arrived at Dunmore 7 days after his envoy, and he arrived alone. That was the detail that set the village buzzing. An Alpha King did not arrive alone. An Alpha King arrived with retinue and ceremony, and the low seismic pressure of a powerful wolf presence that lesser wolves felt in their bones before they saw the horses. He arrived alone, on a gray horse, wearing a riding coat that was fine but not ceremonial, and he rode through the village looking straight ahead with the expression of a man going toward something he'd decided to face before his nerve failed. Marin heard the horse stop outside her cottage. She was in the kitchen garden. She'd heard the buzz travel through the village like a stone dropped in water, and she had come out of the cottage not to watch, but to work, because working with her hands was how she managed things that threatened to overwhelm her. She was on her knees in the late afternoon light, pulling up the last of the autumn parsnips, when she heard the gate latch. She did not look up immediately. She heard him stop a few feet away. She heard him take a breath. Marin. His voice. She had not heard his voice in 5 years. It was lower than she remembered, and it carried something in it that she could not immediately categorize. Not the authority she expected. Not the cold, bureaucratic distance she'd inferred from 8 words and 7 returned envelopes. Something raw. She set the parsnip down on the pile, took her time, brushed the dirt from her hands. Then she stood and looked at him. He was older. The lines at the corners of his eyes were deeper. He looked, she thought, like a man who had governed a difficult kingdom for 5 years without sleeping enough. The silver of his eyes, Emmerich's exact eyes, was watching her with an expression she would not let herself interpret yet. "My envoy gave me an accurate report," he said, "about the boy. Your envoy is thorough. I read your letters." The muscle in his jaw moved. "Marin. I read all 7 of them." Something cold went through her chest, then something hotter. "You read them." She kept her voice even. "And returned 6 unopened, and answered 1 with 8 words telling me not to contact you again. I know what I did. I'm glad someone does." She folded her arms. "Why are you here, Calder?" He exhaled. "I made a decision when I returned to the keep after midsummer. A political decision. A match had been arranged. It fell apart later. It doesn't matter now. But at the time, I decided that what had happened between us was something I had to put behind me. The letters felt like..." He stopped. "I told myself they were complications." She stared at him. "You told yourself your son was a complication." "I told myself I didn't know for certain. You knew." She did not raise her voice. Raised voices were for people who needed others to understand how serious they were. Marin did not need that. "You're an alpha. You had a night with a woman and then she wrote to you. You knew." He did not deny it. A silence settled over the kitchen garden that smelled of cold earth and rosemary blown from the pot by the window. "I want to meet him," Calder said. "I know you do." She looked at him steadily. "That doesn't mean you will. Not today. Not until I decide whether meeting you serves him." His eyes flared, the instinctive reaction of an alpha unused to being told no. And then, slowly, something in his bearing changed. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her across the midsummer fire, except this time there was no fever in it. This time it was clear, and ashamed, and real. "Fair," he said quietly. "That's fair." She had not expected him to say that. She hadn't decided what she was going to do with him yet. But it was the first true thing he'd said, and she put it somewhere small and careful inside her, in case it mattered later. Chapter 5. The Crack in the Stone. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. He did not demand. He brought no guards, no papers, no official weight. He came and he sat on the low stone wall at the edge of the kitchen garden, which was still being put to bed for winter, and sometimes he helped, awkwardly, a man who had not done manual labor in some time, and sometimes he just talked. He talked about the keep, about the mountain territories and their border disputes, about his pack elders and their unceasing political maneuvering. He talked as if she were someone worth speaking to honestly. She suspected he talked to very few people honestly. She tested him on the 3rd day. "He asks about his father," she said, not looking up from the bulbs she was planting. "Not daily, but he asks." Calder went very still on his wall. "What do you tell him?" "I tell him his father lives far away and leads many people, that he is important and busy." She pressed a bulb into the earth with more care than was strictly necessary. "I don't tell him his father was informed of his existence, and chose not to acknowledge it, because Emmerich is 4, and that is not a weight a 4-year-old should carry. You protected him from me." His voice was strained. "Even while I was the one. Even then. Yes." She sat back on her heels. "That's what mothers do, Calder. We protect them from harm, including harm that comes from people we might wish were different." He was quiet for a long time. The wind came down off the Ashvin Mountains, with the smell of coming snow in it. "You deserved better," he finally said. "From the beginning of it, you deserved better than what I gave you." She studied him. He was not performing contrition for an audience. There was no audience. He was a king sitting on a stone wall in a kitchen garden, saying true things into cold air, and the saying of them cost him something visible. She thought about her grandmother's saying, "A seed planted in stone does not die. It waits." "I know I deserved better," she said. I've always known that. I'd like to know whether you do. I do now. He met her eyes. I'm not certain I did then. I am now. She nodded. It was not forgiveness yet, but it was acknowledgement, and acknowledgement was where things that were worth building could begin. Come back at noon tomorrow, she said. He'll be home from the village school by then. The thing that happened to Caldervoss's face when she said that was not kingly, or composed, or remotely alpha. It was simply a man, terrified and grateful, and trying not to let either overwhelm him. She looked away to give him privacy for it. Chapter 6. Silver Eyes. Emmerich met his father the way 4-year-olds meet most things, directly, with complete disregard for the social complexity of the situation, and with a question. Are you very tall because you're a king, or because you ate all your food? Maren pressed her lips together. Calder crouched down to the boy's level, a movement that seemed to come naturally to him, despite everything, and she filed that away, and regarded his son with those mirrored gray eyes. Both, I think, Calder said seriously. And you? Emmerich considered this. He was wearing a knitted cap that had slipped sideways, and a coat that was perfectly good but visibly mended at the cuffs, and he regarded the Alpha King of the Mountain Territories the way he regarded the moth, with focused scholarly interest. I'm 4. I'm still working on it. A reasonable answer. Emmerich inspected him further. Mama says you lead many people. I try to. Do they listen? Calder's mouth did something that was almost a smile. Not always. Mama says that's because powerful people sometimes forget to listen first. Emmerich's small face was entirely earnest. She says listening is more important than talking. The almost smile became actual. Calder glanced up at Maren briefly, and she saw something in his face that made her chest ache, with a complexity she refused to unpack in front of her son. Your mother is right about that, Calder said softly. She's right about most things. He stayed for 2 hours. He and Emmerich sat on the floor of the cottage, and Emmerich explained, at length and with enormous authority, everything he knew about moths, which was considerable. Calder listened. He did not patronize. He asked questions that were real questions, not the performative questions adults ask children to seem interested. He was, Maren observed from the kitchen doorway, with her hands wrapped around a mug of cooling tea, genuinely interested. This was worse, in some ways, than if he'd been terrible with the boy. If he'd been terrible, it would have been simple. When it was time for Emmerich's nap, Calder stood and said farewell with a formality that the boy found hilarious, and that Maren found, she was honest with herself, moving. At the door, before he left, he turned. There are things I need to formally offer, he said. Provision for him. Recognition. Legal name, if you consent to it. His voice was careful. I want him to be acknowledged as my son. Whatever form that takes is your decision. I won't make demands on a child who doesn't know me. I know. She leaned against the doorframe. Come back tomorrow, Calder. We can talk about it then. And you? He stopped himself, then continued. Is there anything... Do you need... What I need, she said, is not to be asked what I need by the person who caused the needing, in a way that sounds like a debt being cleared. She said it without cruelty. What I need, you'll come to know over time, if you're consistent. That's how needs work. You show up, you pay attention, and eventually you understand. He stood in her doorway, and received that like a man who deserved it and knew it. Tomorrow, then, he said. Tomorrow, she agreed. Chapter 7. What the Garden Grew. He came every day for 3 weeks. The village, which had opinions about everything, formed opinions about this. Maren was aware of them peripherally, and ignored them with the same practiced ease she'd developed for ignoring opinions about her lack of a wolf. Let people look. Let them form their conclusions. What mattered was in the cottage, and in the garden, and in the slow and painstaking process of a man learning how to be accountable for something he had done. He never made excuses after that first day. When she asked him questions about the years of silence, he answered them plainly and did not try to soften the answers, and she respected that more than any polished apology would have been. He brought Emmerich a book about moths, illustrated, hand-copied by a scholar at the keep. It was the right gift, not extravagant enough to be a bribe, specific enough to be evidence that he was actually paying attention. Emmerich was thrilled by it. He made Calder read it to him 3 times in a row. Marin watched them on the cottage floor. The great gray king bent over the book with the small boy tucked against his side, and she let herself feel the fullness of the moment without either resisting it or running toward it. It was enough. It did not need to be more than it was yet. On the 21st day, Calder asked to speak to her alone after Emmerich slept. They sat at the kitchen table. She had tea. He had his hands wrapped around a cup he wasn't drinking from. "I have to return to the keep," he said. "The Border Council reconvenes in a fortnight, and I can't defer it further." She nodded. She had known this was coming. "I don't want to disappear again." His voice was low and serious. "I want to be very clear that I understand the weight of that sentence. I understand that I am the last person who should say it and expect it to be believed." "You are," she agreed. "I would like—" He set the cup down. "I would like you and Emmerich to come to the keep. Not immediately. Not in any way that feels like I'm uprooting you or claiming something I haven't earned. But I want to make a case for it. I want you to hear the case and tell me what you think." She was quiet for a moment, looking at her hands on the table. The kitchen smelled of rosemary and wood smoke, and through the window, the winter moon was coming up over the Ashfin Peaks. "What is the case?" she asked. "The case is that my son should know his father. The case is that his father is trying, badly and late, to be something worth knowing." He looked at her steadily. "The case is also that I have been thinking about you for 5 years, Marin. Not pleasantly, because thinking about what I'd done with what I felt, what I'd walked away from, was not a pleasant thing to think about. But I thought about you." She met his gaze. "That's not the same as acting on thinking." "No," he said. "It isn't. I know that. I'm not asking you to count it as currency. I'm asking you to count it as—" he searched for the word— "evidence. That you were real to me, even when I was behaving as if you weren't." She thought about 7 letters and 8 words. She thought about the rosemary tin on the windowsill. "I'll consider it," she said. "I won't answer tonight." "I know." He stood. "I'll be back in the spring, if you want me to be. I'll let you know." He was at the door when she said, "Calder." He turned. She looked at him across the small kitchen with the moonlight on both of them. "Emmerich's name should be Emmerich Voss. If you're willing to recognize him formally, he should have your name." The thing that crossed his face was beyond description. He breathed once, very carefully. "Yes," he said. "I'm willing. I'm grateful. Good night. Good night, Marin." She listened to his horse's hooves fade into the dark. Then she got up and went to the windowsill. She took the rosemary tin down and opened it. The small folded letter was still there. 8 words, an initial, a language that had tried to sound formal and succeeded only in sounding afraid. She looked at it for a long time. Then she folded it once more and placed it back inside and set the tin in its spot in the moonlight and went to bed. She was not finished with it yet, but she was beginning to understand what it was evidence of, not only of his failing, but of a crack that had been there all along in the stone of him, waiting for light. Chapter 8. The crack that let the light through spring came to Dunmore with mud and snowmelt and the particular exuberance of a world relearning color. His letter arrived in February. It was 4 pages, which was 4 pages longer than anything she had ever received from him, and it was not bureaucratic, and it was not 8 words. It was a careful, considered, detailed account of what he had prepared at the keep, a suite of rooms, Emmerich's name registered in the book of lines, a formal withdrawal of the correspondent's declined directive, which he included as evidence because he understood now that she collected evidence, and that evidence was how she guarded herself, and that this was entirely reasonable. At the bottom he had written, "I am not asking you to trust me. I am asking you to let me try to be trustworthy. Those are different requests. She read it twice, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood. Then she wrote back. One page, clear, warm, and honest. She said they would come in May. She said she had conditions, which she listed, and that if the conditions were not met, she would return to Dunmore without apology. She said that Emmerich had asked about him again last week, and she had told him, for the first time, that his father was trying to be someone worth knowing. Is he worth knowing? Emmerich had asked with the directness of a child who had not yet learned to soften questions. I think he might be, she told him. I think he's working on it. She included that exchange in the letter. Not to wound, to make clear what she was building toward. Not forgiveness as a gift freely given, not trust as a romantic gesture, but both as things earned by action, incrementally, over time. She sealed the letter and walked it to the post herself, through the mud and the snowmelt and the pale March light, and she felt something lift from her shoulders that she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten it had a shape. She was not starting over. She was starting from where she was, which was a different thing entirely. She was a woman who had grown extraordinary tomatoes in impossible soil, who had raised a brave and curious boy in a village that had overlooked her, who had written 7 letters into silence, and still had enough left in her to write an 8th when it became worth writing. The seed planted in stone. She had not died. She had waited for the crack. Epilogue, 1 year later. The rosemary tin lived on a windowsill now in the keep. Marin had carried it herself in her basket of essential things, along with Emmerich's moth book and her grandmother's mortar and pestle and 2 jars of seeds from the Dunmore garden. It sat on the wide stone sill of the rooms that were hers, only hers, until she decided differently. With the winter light of the high mountains coming through the glass and the smell of dried rosemary faint and constant in the air, she had learned the keep slowly, the way she learned all things, by moving through it with attention rather than speed. She had learned which pack healers were skilled and which were merely confident. She had found a corner of the kitchen courtyard with rocky, inhospitable soil, and she was currently in a dispute with the head groundskeeper about whether it was suitable for a garden. She was going to win the dispute. The pack elders had opinions about her. Of course they did. A wolfless woman from a hem-of-the-mountain village, no title, no shift, arriving with the king's son and a basket of kitchen tools. She heard what they said. She chose her responses carefully and let her actions answer the rest, because that was what she had always done. Emmerich was magnificent. He had been in the keep for 8 months, and he had adopted it the way children adopt things, completely, without reservation, with the whole heart. He had opinions about every corridor and the loyalty of a small person with a large personality. He called Calder father the way he said most things, directly and without ceremony, and the word seemed to do something to Calder every time. Something that had not been there before, and was now quietly permanent. Calder had kept every condition she'd laid out. Every one. She had not had to correct him more than twice on the important ones, and he had accepted the corrections with the same barefaced honesty that had begun the spring before on the kitchen wall. She did not call it love yet. Not to him. But she thought about it. She thought about it in the evenings when the 3 of them were in the same room, and the room felt like it fit. And she thought about it when he sat with Emmerich on the floor, reading the moth book again at Emmerich's insistence, and she thought about it most acutely on the night in October, when he had taken her hand in the corridor outside the great hall and simply held it, without demand or expectation, until she decided whether she wanted it held. She had let him hold it for a long time. She was thinking about that, standing at her windowsill in the December light with the rosemary tin in her hands, when there was a knock at the door of her rooms. Calder came in without ceremony, because she had told him to stop announcing himself like he was seeking an audience. He was wearing the slightly disheveled look of someone who had been in council for hours, and had not yet recovered his composure. "The elders want to know what title you'd like," he said. "Formally. They need something for the council rolls." She looked at him. "What title did they suggest?" "Several things involving the word consort, which I know you don't like, and one person suggested royal herbalist as a compromise, which—" His mouth twitched. Which is more accurate than any of the others, she said, and put the tin back on the sill. Tell them. Marin Ashvile. That's title enough. He looked at the tin. He had learned to read her, slowly, the way she had learned to read the keep, with attention and care. He knew the tin. She had told him about the tin and what was inside it, and he had listened without defending himself, because he was learning when not to defend himself, which was most of the time. Is that still in there? He asked quietly. Yes. He crossed to the window and stood beside her. They were both looking at the tin. Outside, the first snow of December was beginning on the peaks. He started. No. She picked up the tin, turned it in her hands. I keep it because it's evidence, Calder. Not against you. Not anymore. She looked at him. Evidence that I tried. Evidence that I survived the silence. Evidence that a seed planted in stone. She stopped. He was looking at her with those silver-gray eyes that were also Emmeric's eyes, with an expression that she was finally ready to name. Does not die, he finished softly. It waits for the crack. She was quiet for a moment. I told you that saying, she said. You did. In one of the letters. His voice was very low. The 6th one, I think. I read it so many times I thought I'd worn the paper out. She held the tin. The rosemary was still faintly sweet in the cold air. The snow was falling past the glass. Somewhere in the keep, she could hear Emmerich explaining something to someone at top volume, which was his preferred mode. She set the tin back on the sill. Then she took Calder's hand, the way he had taken hers in October, without demand. He closed his fingers around hers. Outside the mountains waited, enormous and patient, the way mountains always did. Inside, quietly, the light came through. A seed planted in stone does not die. It waits for the crack that lets the light through. She understood it now, in her bones, in the way her grandmother had always meant it. Not as a story about suffering, but as a story about the persistence of worth. Her worth. The kind no coldness could cancel, no silence could dissolve, no 8 words could erase. It had been there all along. It had simply been waiting for someone with enough courage to let it be seen and